At 10:17 a.m. on November 5, 1943, Staff Sergeant William Sandy Sanford rotated the twin, 50 caliber guns of his B-17's top turret and watched the sky fracture. Over 70 German fighters Focke-Wulf FUV 190 and Messerschmitt Bf 109 were climbing to meet the 21 fortresses of his group. They were 27 minutes from the Focke-Wulf factory at Marionberg. 21 years old. Nebraska farm kid. 11 missions. 0 kills. In the open waste, Staff Sergeant Frank Bostrom felt the cold first, negative 52 degrees Fahrenheit, at 26,000 feet. Chicago machinist, 9 missions. His single, 50 caliber, was a last line of defense. Doctrine was clear: short bursts, conserve ammo, defend your sector. The manual said a waist gunner wasn't for attacking. The manuals were about to be proven catastrophically wrong. The German tactic was a two-part kill. Wave 1, a head-on pass from 12 o'clock high. Closing speed, 600 miles per hour. The bomber's top turret had 1.5 seconds to respond. Wave 2, as the formation reeled from the frontal assault, a second group, lurking 4,000 feet below, would pull up into the blind spot beneath the bombers' bellies. They targeted wing roots and fuel tanks. It was a surgical, coordinated slaughter. Sandy Sanford had seen it work. On his 7th mission, he'd watched a fortress take a head-on hit. As it faltered, 2 Fellevue 190 seconds from the low group rose up and tore its wing off. He'd been powerless, his turret still tracking the wrong threat. Frank Bostrom's education was more visceral. On his 4th mission, a 20mm shell from a low-attacking fighter exploded in the waist. It killed the left gunner, a kid named Charlie, and put 17 pieces of shrapnel in Bostrom's side. The surgeon said. He was aiming for the wing. Bostrom didn't feel lucky. He felt a cold, specific rage. They were hunting the men inside the machine. Now, over the Baltic, the pattern unfolded perfectly. Sandy, in his turret, saw the first wave of 8 Fu 190 climbing for their head-on run. Then he saw the second wave, 8 more circling like sharks far below, waiting. The geometry of the massacre was clear. Pilot from top turret, Sanford said, his voice tight. Low group stacked under us. They're waiting for the head-on pass. They'll hit our bellies when we're distracted. In the waist, Bostrom heard it. He leaned out, the wind tearing at his goggles, and looked down. There they were, dark crosses, keeping pace, waiting. His grip on his gun tightened. He wasn't going to wait for them to come up shooting. Not this time. The first wave hit at 10:23. A shallow dive from straight ahead. Wings sparkled with cannon fire. Sanford's twin, 50 seconds, shook his frame. He let a target, fired, saw pieces fly off an engine cowling. The fighter vanished. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The 7 remaining Germans blew past and dove beneath the formation. Act 1 was complete. Heads up, low sector, here they come. The ball turret gunner's shriek filled the intercom. Bostrom was already watching. The moment the first wave broke, the second group pulled their noses up. A steep, power-driven climb straight for the bombers' soft underbellies. The lead Fu 190's yellow nose cone pointed right at them. Doctrine screamed, "Wait. Let them enter your sector. Fire short bursts. Conserve ammo." The memory of Charlie's blood burned through the Doctrine like acid. Bostrom did not wait. He did not aim. He pointed his gun straight down and held both triggers down. The sound wasn't a brrr. It was a continuous, ripping snarl. Empty brass formed a solid, golden stream. Recoil became a constant, brutal shove. He wasn't shooting at a plane. He was trying to fill a piece of the sky with so much metal nothing could fly through it alive. It was, by every manual, a hysterical waste. The German pilot never expected it. He flinched. His smooth climb wavered for a split second. Bostrom's wild stream of bullets walked upward. Tracers intersected the FW 190's left wing route. A flash of orange, greasy black smoke. The fighter's climb stalled, rolled, and fell away. Bostrom didn't see the kill. He was already swinging his glowing barrel toward the next threat, still firing. In the top turret, Sandy Sanford saw it all. The insane, sustained fire. The kill. A thought, cold and clear, cut through his adrenaline. They're not used to aggression. They expect us to be passive. The low-side attack had been disrupted. but not broken. More fighters rose. The first wave was reforming. Trouble Bell was in a tightening kill box. Sanford made his decision. Conservation was for a long war. This fight would last 5 minutes. If he lost, there was no next mission. He had 2 guns. The Germans had a plan. His job was to shatter it with overwhelming, unexpected violence. He saw a full 190 leading a slicing attack on the lead bomber. Sanford traversed his turret and fired not at the leader, but into the formation behind it. A long, sweeping burst painted a line across the sky. The following fighters scattered. The coordinated attack dissolved. The leader, suddenly alone, dove away. Top turret, what's your ammo status? The pilot's voice was tense. Enough, sir, Sanford replied. He didn't know. He didn't care. Below, Bostrom's first 250-round box was gone, expended in 30 seconds. He kicked the empty box aside, slammed in a fresh belt. His gloves smoked where they touched the searing receiver. They had just rewritten the first rule. Do not conserve. Overwhelm. The coordinated German kill was coming apart at the seams, and the seams were being torn by 2 sergeants who had decided, simultaneously, to attack. Sandy Sanford's world became a series of frantic calculations. The German fighters, trained to exploit predictable, defensive fire, were now facing chaos. A FU 190 made a pass from 2 o'clock high. Sanford fired a 3-second burst, not at the fighter, but ahead of it, forcing the pilot to brake left directly into the waiting guns of a neighboring B-17. The fortress's nose gunner seized the opportunity, and the W-190 disintegrated in a fireball. It wasn't a kill, Sanford would claim. It was better. It was orchestration. In the waist, Frank Bostrom's second box of ammo was nearly gone. His barrel glowed a dull cherry red. He saw a BF-109 climbing from 5 o'clock low, aiming for their right inboard engine. Standard defense said to track and fire. Bostrom's new doctrine said, dominate the space. He fired a long, raking burst across the fighter's projected path, a wall of lead the pilot had to fly through. The German jinked violently, his own cannon fire going wild. The engine was safe. The fighter dove away. But the sheer volume of fire was unsustainable. The intercom crackled with terse reports. Right waist, down to my last belt. Ball turret, low. Tail, half. Sanford had 1 fresh box per gun left. The German fighters, sensing the initial storm was slackening, began to press harder. The tactic of rage had bought time, not immunity. Then, the enemy adapted. They stopped making individual, courageous passes. Instead, 4 FU 190 seconds formed a tight finger 4 and came in together from the front and right, forcing Sanford to choose a target. He picked the lead, fired, saw hits, but the wingman, untouched, pressed in. Cannon shells ripped through Trouble Bell's right wing, shredding metal. The aircraft shuddered. In the waist, Bostrom felt the impact. He swung his gun, but the fighters were already gone, diving away. They were learning. They were using their numbers to absorb the defensive fury. Worse, the low-attack fighters changed their angle. Instead of climbing straight up, they began making high-side passes, coming from 10 o'clock high and diving through the formation, a zone where only Sanford's top turret could engage, and he was already overwhelmed by the frontal threats. Trouble Bell was being systematically pulled apart. The ammunition counters plummeted. The early, glorious aggression had become a desperate, draining fight for survival. They had shocked the Germans, but shock doesn't last. Sanford keyed his intercom, his voice stripped of all emotion. They're coordinating. They're soaking up our fire. We can't keep this up. A new voice crackled over the radio. It was the tail gunner of the B-17 Dakota Queen, flying off their left quarter. Trouble Bell, we see your 3 o'clock low. We'll cover. Before Sanford could respond, a stream of tracers from Dakota Queen's waist gunner lanced across the sky, intercepting a FU 190 lining up on Trouble Bell's vulnerable right flank. The German pilot, attacked from an unexpected angle, broke off. It was a moment of pure, unscripted solidarity. The rigid, defend-your-own-sector discipline was breaking down, not into chaos, but into a fluid, mutual defense. Inspired by Trouble Bell's initial, violent refusal to die passively, the other gunners began to fire protectively, covering gaps in their neighbors' armor. The German fighters found themselves facing not a collection of isolated bombers, but a suddenly integrated, prickly hedgehog of interlocking fire. A fighter diving on Trouble Bell would find itself targeted by the top turret of the bomber behind. One attacking from below would be met by crossfire from two waist positions in different aircraft. The kill box around Trouble Bell didn't disappear, but it became lethally porous for the attackers. The cost of pressing home an attack skyrocketed. Sandy Sanford saw it happening. He stopped trying to be everywhere. He started communicating. "Tail, I've lost visual on your 6 o'clock low. I see him, Top. He's mine." The tail gunner's reply was followed by the satisfying sight of a Bf-109 peeling away, trailing smoke. This was the real, unplanned breakthrough. The foolish rage had been the spark. What followed was the evolution, coordinated, mutually supportive aggression. They were no longer 10 separate bombers. For a few critical minutes, they became one distributed weapon. But weapons consume fuel, and their fuel was ammunition. As the coast of Germany receded behind them and the bomb run began, the gunners' rate of fire slowed, not from discipline, but from necessity. The barrels cooled. The shouts over the intercom became grim inventories. Top turret, dry. Right waist, maybe 10 rounds. Left waist, 40. The bombardier's calm voice cut through. Bombs away. Trouble Bell leapt upward, suddenly lighter. The formation turned for home. Ahead lay the long, defenseless flight back across the North Sea. The German fighters would be waiting, refueled, rearmed, and angry. They had survived the outward leg by rewriting the rules. Now, they would have to survive the return trip with empty guns, their only weapon being the legend of their rage, and the hope that the cooperation it inspired had taken root in the formation around them. The bluff of the century was about to begin. The silence was the worst part. As Trouble Bell droned away from the hellfire of Marionberg, the absence of gunfire was deafening. Sandy Sanford stared at the empty ammunition counters in his top turret. 0. Frank Bostrom, in the waist, looked at the 10 remaining rounds in his belt, then at his gun barrel warped and blackened, its steel memory shattered by heat. It was useless. The intercom was a graveyard of numbers. Ball turret, dry. Tail, 30 rounds. Left waist, 40. They were a 25-ton glider in the most hostile sky on Earth. Lieutenant Kowalski's voice was flat over the intercom. "They'll be waiting." And they were. The Luftwaffe, having landed to rearm, swarmed back up. They found the battered bomber stream, and quickly they found Trouble Bell, the ship that had caused so much trouble. The word had spread on German radio frequencies, the aggressive Wehrmacht with the furious gunners. 190 seconds made a cautious, probing pass. They expected the usual defiance. They were met with nothing, just the bomber, flying straight and level. The German pilots edged closer. From Trouble Bell's left waist, a desperate 4-round burst snapped out. The rounds fell pathetically short. It was a confession. The hunters knew. The beast was toothless. What followed was a display of pure, theatrical desperation. Sanford keyed his intercom. "Pilot, on my mark, hard 5-second dive. Then level out." Kowalski, out of options, replied, "You've got it." A-190 lined up for the kill from 1 o'clock high. "Mark," Sanford yelled. Kowalski shoved the yoke forward. Trouble Bell's nose dropped, screaming into a dive. To the German pilot, it was inexplicable, a bomber breaking formation, presenting its broad back. He followed, sensing the end. What he couldn't see was Sandy Sanford in the top turret, now looking up as his bomber dove. Sanford didn't fire his empty guns. He physically hauled the entire turret around, muscles straining, to keep its imposing twin barrels pointed directly at the pursuing fighter. Through his sight, he tracked the German perfectly, a silent, menacing stare. The pilot saw those 2 dark circles locked onto him. He hesitated, waiting for the muzzle flashes that never came. His attack run faltered. Trouble Bell pulled out of the dive and muscled back into formation. The bluff absurd, physically demanding, had worked once. It was a trick that couldn't work twice. The next attack would be the end. Then, the miracle occurred. The other bombers had witnessed Trouble Bell's lone battle. They had seen the Germans give it a wide berth. They had felt the shift to mutual defense. As the Luftwaffe now converged on the defenseless ship, the gunners in the surrounding B-17 made a collective, unspoken decision. A 4-190 came in for the kill on Trouble Bell's right wing. From the bomber directly behind, a top turret gunner opened up. His tracers didn't defend his own ship. They arced across the sky to intercept the fighter attacking Trouble Bell. A waist gunner from another fortress added his fire. Then another. The German pilot, expecting no resistance, flew into a sudden, lethal crossfire from 3 different bombers. He peeled away, trailing smoke. It was the spark. What followed was a spontaneous, devastating display of formation defense reborn. Gunners abandoned strict sector discipline. They fired protectively, covering their wounded neighbor. The selfish doctrine of protect your own was replaced by the older instinct, protect the herd. The German attacks, which should have been a final massacre, dissolved into chaos. Faced with this new, cooperative aggression, the Luftwaffe pilots lost their edge. The kill ratio shifted. Trouble Bell, the catalyst, flew untouched through the heart of the battle, her empty guns silent, shielded by the very tactic her crew's rage had inspired. When the white cliffs of Dover finally appeared, the silence in Trouble Bell was one of stunned disbelief. They had made it. At the debrief, the claims sounded insane. Sanford, from his empty turret, claimed 3. Bostrom, with his 10 rounds, claimed 2. Corroborated by other crews, the tally for Trouble Bell's gunners was set at a staggering 15 enemy aircraft destroyed. The intelligence officers were skeptical. The ammunition reports were horrifying, over 5,000 rounds fired by 2 men. It was wastefulness on a court-martial scale. But the results were undeniable. Lower losses. Factory destroyed. A palpable shift in the group's spirit. Sandy Sanford and Frank Bostrom were not court-martialed. They received silver stars. But the real reward was the whispered legend that spread through the 8th Air Force. The Marionberg rage taught a brutal lesson. Aggression changes calculus. A moment of overwhelming violence could disrupt the enemy so completely it saved more than it spent. Both men finished their tours. Sanford returned to Nebraska, took over the farm, and never spoke of the war. Bostrom went back to Chicago, to the machine shop, and found he could no longer stand the sound of a pneumatic press. It sounded too much like a charging .50 caliber. The manuals never officially changed. But in ready rooms and on freezing flight lines, a new phrase entered the lexicon. Pull a Sandy. It meant to pour it on, to break the attack cycle with sheer, defiant volume. It was a tribute to the day 2 sergeants, out of options and out of patience, decided the only way to defend their fortress was to attack with everything they had. And in doing so, they rewrote the unwritten rules of survival in the bloody skies over Europe. The final reports were filed. The intelligence officers gone. The silver stars pinned. The Air Force never officially acknowledged the legitimacy of the 15-kill claim. Officially, the astonishing numbers were classified as probables, damaged, and confirmed in a bureaucratic shuffle. But within the 91st Bomb Group, the story became gospel. The legend of Trouble Bell, solidified in the foggy pubs and Nissen huts of England, passed in low voices with pints of warm beer in hand. Sandy Sanford and Frank Bostrom were heroes, but they were also problems. Their actions were a direct contradiction to the very doctrine of fire discipline that schools taught and which the Army Air Forces relied upon to manage its sprawling war effort. A board of senior officers convened a closed-door review. The pilot, navigator, and bombardier of Trouble Bell sat in a small, stuffy office at HQ and were asked, repeatedly, about the volume of fire expended. Did Sergeant Bostrom, in your opinion, lose control? No, sir. Did he, in a state of panic, neglect his sector to fire at extreme range? He saved the ship, sir. The meeting ended without a verdict. The official record was allowed to stand. Unofficially, the gunnery instructors at the replacement training units received a new, informal memo. It was a single paragraph appended to the standard lecture on trigger discipline. While conservation of ammunition is paramount, recent combat experience indicates the highest probability of survival is achieved by concentrated, overwhelming fire at the initiation of a coordinated enemy attack. Hesitation can be more costly than expenditure. It was as close to a doctrinal change as they would get. In the field, it was all the permission the gunners needed. 3 weeks after Marionberg, a green crew on their first mission was briefed by a grizzled crew chief. He didn't talk about the manuals. He said, "You see 'em lining up, you don't wait. You make 'em think the whole damn sky is on fire. You pull a Sandy, got it? The crew, wide-eyed, nodded. They didn't know who Sandy was. They understood the principle. In the waist of his new bomber, Frank Bostrom flew 5 more missions. He never fired another round. His new crew knew his story and kept him in the ship as a talisman, a walking lesson. On his final mission, a rookie waist gunner, seeing fighters form up, began to fire, in short, by the book bursts. Bostrom, standing behind him, reached over the shaking kid's shoulder, slapped his hands away from the triggers for a split second, then pointed a gloved finger at the enemy formation and made a single, sweeping motion, hose it down. The kid understood. He held the triggers. The sustained fire broke the attack before it began. On the ground, Sandy Sanford was transferred to a gunnery instructor post. He stood before classrooms of new gunners, his Silver Star ribbon the only color on his olive drab jacket. He would hold up a single, 50 caliber round. This, he'd say, his Nebraska twang flat in the quiet room, cost the government 28 cents. That pilot you're looking at through your sight? He'd pause, letting the image form. He cost the German government 18 years of food, schooling, and flight training. You tell me which one you should be more careful with. Then he'd set the round down. But if you wait to fire because you're counting pennies, he'll put a 20mm shell, which cost him nothing to fire right through your cockpit. Your pilot is worth more than all the ammo on this ship. Sometimes, the only way to save him is to spend it all, if you have to. He never mentioned Marionberg. He didn't have to. The rumor mill did it for him. He was the living embodiment of the new calculus. Back in Germany, the Luftwaffe noticed the change. Intercepted pilot debriefs and intelligence summaries noted a shift in American defensive tactics by late November 1943. Increased aggression, one report stated, a willingness to engage at longer range with sustained fire. This disrupts formation attacks and appears designed to break our morale and coordination, not just defend their bomber. The German solution was to develop heavier armor, to push through the wall of lead, but that added weight, which reduced performance. The elegant, predatory dance of the fighter was being corrupted by the brute force, democratic defense of the bomber box. The initiative was subtly, irrevocably shifting. The war moved on. Trouble Bell flew another 11 missions before being rotated home. She was stripped of her guns and her name and ended her days as a grounded training airframe in Texas. Her combat log, with the entry for the 5th of November 1943, was filed away. Sandy Sanford mustered out in 1945 and went back to the Nebraska farm. He married his high school sweetheart, raised 3 children, and died in 1998 of a heart attack while fixing a tractor. His obituary mentioned he was a veteran of the air war over Europe. Frank Bostrom returned to Chicago, to the machine shop. The sound of metal on metal was his therapy and his penance. He had recurring dreams of a yellow nose cone rising through a stream of tracers. He never attended a reunion. He died in 2007. His daughter found his Silver Star in a tobacco tin with a single, bent, 50 caliber cartridge. Their legacy wasn't in medals or official reports. It was in a phrase, a mentality that trickled down through the ranks. Pulling a Sandy became shorthand for the moment when discipline had to give way to instinct, when the textbook was thrown out the window in favor of survival. It acknowledged that the cold mathematics of war could, in a critical instant, be overruled by the hot logic of fury. The final, quiet victory of the Marionberg rage was this. It made the fortresses harder to kill. It taught every gunner that he was not just a defender, but a deterrent, that his greatest weapon was not the gun itself, but the will to use it without limit. In the cold, thin air, where seconds meant life or death, that lesson saved more crews than any revised manual ever could. The true impact of that day over Marionberg was never measured in reports or medals. It was measured in the quiet confidence of gunners on later missions, in the way a formation would tighten almost imperceptibly when fighters were called, and in the low, steady hum of 50 caliber fire that began a few seconds earlier and lasted a few seconds longer than it had before. It became part of the culture, an ethos. Before November 5th, 1943, a gunner firing a continuous 30-second burst would have been pulled from his position, possibly charged. After, While never officially condoned, it was understood. Sometimes, the sky demanded rage. 18 months later, near the war's end, a young top turret gunner on a B-17 named Fortune's Fool found his formation targeted by the new, terrifying German jet, the Me-262. It streaked past at over 500 miles per hour, its 30mm cannons ripping a bomber ahead of them to pieces. As it banked for another, slower pass, the young gunner, trained by an instructor who'd served with the 91st, didn't track it. He hosed the airspace where the jet would have to turn. He emptied half his ammunition in one sustained, roaring torrent. The 262 pilot, faced with a wall of fire where he expected clear sky, aborted his attack and fled. The gunner had never heard of Sandy Sanford, but he had, instinctively, pulled a Sandy. That was the legacy. Not 15 kills, but a shift in mindset that propagated through the force like a virus. The Army Air Forces, in its final analysis, credited improved fighter escort and radar jamming technology for the falling loss rates in 1944 to 45. The men in the waist and the turrets knew another reason. They had stopped fighting defensively. They had started fighting to win their piece of the sky, right then and there. After the war, the story morphed. In sensationalized accounts, Sandy and Frank became one mythical gunner who single-handedly shot down 15 planes. The nuance, the mutual defense, the empty guns, the bluff was sanded away for a better tale. But the core truth remained. On one mission, the rulebook was burned, and what rose from the ashes was more effective. Sandy Sanford's Nebraska farmhouse had a single photograph on the mantel, a grainy shot of a B-17 inches flight. He never pointed it out. Frank Bostrom's bent, 50 caliber round sat in its tobacco tin, a private relic of a public fury. They both carried the same quiet understanding. They had not been heroes of skill, but of necessity. They had been cornered animals, and in their corner, they found a new way to fight. Today, if you visit the archives, you can find the dried-out, typewritten after-action report for Trouble Bell. The 15-kill claim is there, amended in neat pen to 5 confirmed, 10 shared, or probable. The ammunition expenditure report is attached, a silent, shocking testament to that morning's fury. Together, they tell the real story, not of miraculous accuracy, but of overwhelming volume. Not of individual brilliance, but of inspired mutual protection. That's how change happens in war. Not in headquarters, but in the desperation of a single moment. In a top turret where a farm boy decides the manual is a death sentence, and in a frozen waste where a machinist decides that saving his friends is worth breaking every gun in the Air Force. Their rage was not foolish, it was tactical. It was the birth of a new doctrine, written not on paper, but in the empty ammunition boxes scattered across the floor of a B-17, and in the minds of every gunner who came after and heard the story. They proved a single eternal principle. When you are out of everything else, you are not out of the fight. You still have your will, and sometimes the will to unleash hell is the only weapon you need. If this story of defiant will and the unbreakable bond of a crew resonates with you, hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that these forgotten lessons in courage are worth remembering. Subscribe and ring the bell for more. We are a global community built around these memories. Drop a comment below, tell us where you're watching from. Have you ever heard a similar story of desperate, against the odds ingenuity? We read every single one. Thank you for watching, and thank you for ensuring the defiant rage of Trouble Bell's gunners against a sky full of enemies is not lost to silence. Their fury, in the end, was a calculated and brilliant salvation.